People will always come and go in our lives, but we all know those few who never left because they always leave you with so much more. The ones who make you stronger, build you up when you're broken down. The partners who've always had you covered. At Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, we know what it means to be covered by someone you look up to, even when they're sitting right beside you. To be covered by someone guiding you through more than just the routine. To be covered by that friend you consider the best because that's how they make you feel. At Blue Cross, we know what it means to be there, guiding you toward a healthier state of mind. Because the more we know as individuals, the healthier we all feel as a community. Through it all.
We run an online community of over 100,000 skilled volunteers who can help you with marketing, technology, finance, and more, completely pro bono. Whether it's conserving the environment, supporting education, or fighting for civil rights, they're eager to support causes they care about by volunteering their skills.
When teachers look out over their classrooms, they don't just see kids. They don't just see students. They see the future. Finance directors and family therapists, CEOs and PR specialists, robotics engineers and electricians, musicians and medical technicians, and of course, future teachers. Teachers not only see the future, teachers give rise to the future. Introducing the Charles Butt Scholarship for Aspiring Teachers. $8,000 annual scholarships, mentorship from teachers and principals, professional development opportunities, participation in a statewide network of Charles Butt Scholars, 100 scholarships available from 10 partner universities. Give rise to the future. Teach. For more information and to apply, visit raisingtexasteachers.org.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Rural Texas, the Tribune's latest, greatest virtual event. This ambitious week-long symposium, our second on the subject in 2 years, will discuss how our rapidly urbanizing state honors its agricultural and ranching heritage while acknowledging the realities of the modern world. Today, we're hosting two great conversations on education. The Tribune's Aliyya Swaby leads the first on the future of rural public education, and afterward, the Trib's Kate McGee moderates a discussion about higher ed. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our symposium's sponsors: the Texas Rural Funders, NRG Energy, the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute and the Hackett Center, the Texas Farm Bureau, Texas 2036, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, the Texas Agriculture Council, the Texas Association of Community Colleges, Raise Your Hand Texas, the Texas Corn Producers Association, the Texas Municipal League, Texas Tech University, the Office of Public Insurance Counsel, the Texas Organization of Rural and Community Hospitals, the Plains Cotton Growers, the Texas Forestry Association, the Texas Agricultural Cooperative Council, the Texas Grain and Feed Association, the Texas Cattle Feeders, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers, the Texas Statewide Telephone Cooperative, the Texas Rural Water Association, the Texas Wheat Producers Board and Association, the Texas Grain Sorghum Association, the Association of Rural Communities in Texas, the Texas Poultry Federation, the Texas Rural Health Association, and the Texas Association of Dairymen. Thanks as well to our media partners, KBTX and the Eagle. Now I'll turn it over to Aliyya Swaby to get us started.
Hi, my name's Aliyya Swaby, and I'm the public education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in to this conversation on public education as part of the Texas Tribune Symposium on the Future of Rural Texas. I'm joined today by Gary VanDeaver, Georgina Pérez, and Donna Hale. To introduce our speakers, Gary VanDeaver has represented House District 1 since 2015. He sits on the Public Education and Appropriations Committees. Prior to his election to the Texas House, VanDeaver was a 33-year rural educator, serving most recently as superintendent of New Boston Independent School District in Bowie County. Georgina Pérez is a member of the State Board of Education, representing District. Previously, she served as an English teacher and administrator in the Isleta Independent School District for more than 10 years. Pérez is also the founder of the literature distribution nonprofit Tu Libro and the Cotton Valley Scholars Program. And lastly, we have Donna Hale, who's the superintendent of Miami ISD, a single campus district for grades pre-K through 12, located in the Texas Panhandle. In 2017, she was named the top superintendent in Region 16. Let's start by talking about the main challenge weighing on education and a lot of other issues right now, the ongoing pandemic, which is surging across the state, including in some of Texas's rural regions. Superintendent Hale, can you talk to us about how the pandemic has changed the way you've approached this school year?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the invite to be here. It has definitely been a very challenging year. One of the things that I think most small and rural schools are struggling with is the complexity of the funding, such as the CARES Act process. It is very complex, and the time involved for that, a lot of superintendents and school leaders have decided not to apply for that funding. We just don't have the time available with all the other many hats we have to wear in a district. The TEA, the Operation Connectivity, has also been something that I found interesting. TEA donated 50% to whatever the bill was, our expenses. Then we were asked if we could find either the city or the county to contribute another 25%, and then TEA would contribute the remaining 25%. So I guess the question is, why could TEA not have just upfront done the 75% without us having to make more contacts, more connections when we were already extremely busy and overwhelmed?
Can you talk to me about how the funding is impacting things on the ground? Like, what would that mean for your ability to keep up health and safety standards, your ability to have instruction look the way that you want it to in a difficult year?
We have had to purchase additional Chromebooks, hotspots, LMS, just new curriculum that we have not had in place before for remote learning. We have had to buy thermometers, PPE, additional custodial service just to mitigate the risk of additional outbreaks of any COVID.
Yeah, and your district was one of a growing number of school districts that chose to get rid of the remote learning option in October, which has been controversial in some districts. What were the challenges for you of having students learning remotely and learning on campus at the same time?
The biggest challenge was just the lack of broadband internet. So we have students that do not have reliable internet, and when you're trying to do live teaching, it was constantly buffering. So students were frustrated, teachers were frustrated, parents are frustrated, and we had such a small percentage of students, actually we only had 2 at the time that were doing remote learning. And since we have had little, we've been very fortunate, little outbreak with the COVID, we felt it was in the students' best interest to come to campus.
Right. Representative VanDeaver, can you talk to us about what you're hearing from rural school districts about how they're weathering the pandemic, both financially and academically? And after, I'm going to go to you with that same question, Georgina.
Yes, and let me say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. It's a very important conversation. Much of what we just heard from superintendent is exactly what I'm hearing from the superintendents in my area, in my district. The challenges of the remote learning. We have schools that have a good number of students doing remote learning, and those students that are just really struggling to get those students in attendance, get those students engaged, and really have them take part in the education process. So they're very frustrated with that. Of course, broadband access continues to be such an issue in rural Texas, and we're seeing that in my district as well. Funding is certainly an issue. We see so many of our schools with students who are just not there and not sure where they are. I'm convinced they have not left, but they are not in school. And so what are we going to do moving forward to make the district whole, I think is a big question, because obviously under our current model, funding is based on student attendance. And so we have been able, the commissioner has been able to work with House Public Ed and Senate Ed to waive and kind of freeze funding through the semester, through Christmas, basically. And so what are we going to do beyond that, I think, is a real question.
Yeah, Georgina, do you want to jump in here?
So there's nothing different that's coming out of West Texas and along the border that Representative VanDeaver or Superintendent Hale haven't already mentioned. Our biggest challenge is, from the parent and student perspective, is the broadband connection. And out here where I live right now, we're on a satellite because there is no broadband infrastructure. And the idea that we had to have hotspots and Chromebooks as an additional expense for our school districts is just ridiculous, particularly in the 21st century. And then for people to learn, which is difficult to say, right? People are learning that in 2020, hotspots don't work in all geography. We've known this, right? Operation Connectivity is doing yet again another study to tell us what we have known for 20 years, if not longer. And so it feels like we're spending a lot of time not solving the problem.
Great. I've talked to a couple of rural school superintendents just in my reporting who have said that they feel like there's a lot of emphasis right now on urban and suburban school districts in proposing solutions for the pandemic, and not necessarily a lot of them on rural school districts. Georgina, maybe let's start with you. What are the ways in which you feel like those differences are most pronounced? Like, what are things that are just not true for rural school districts that are maybe more true for urban and suburban school districts?
So in rural El Paso County, which is far east El Paso County, I think the myth is that we're, number one, a suburban area. We're not. Number two, that school buses can drive through dirt roads. They cannot. That school buses can park somewhere and we can all access the internet. There isn't a place that a school bus could park, because out here where we live, we don't have neighbors for 10 miles, right? So if a school bus were parked near me, it would have to go through several dirt roads and it wouldn't reach my neighbors, so to speak, right? And then of course that and I will say this from a very personal perspective. My children are picking up a packet of papers to do on Tuesday and turning it in the following Tuesday when I get a new pack of papers. And so, you remember the game, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? No. My two fifth graders are struggling while my daughter thinks it's fantastic. And she, it's great that she's the teacher in the classroom. My son is taking a test, grading it himself and giving himself hundreds, right? But in the bigger picture, my children are going to have to repeat this grade, right? And I accept that, right? That's a choice that we're making. And my kids will probably be okay graduating a year behind or 2 years behind. But what about our English learners who don't have someone at home because they're essential workers? What about our children in special education? When we're talking about these kids, right, our high risk priority population kids, 8 months of educational loss is the equivalent of 8 years. And a whole bunch of those kids may not recover. And those are real challenges in rural areas that simply are not being discussed, much less addressed.
Right. Yeah. Superintendent Hale, can you speak to that question of some of the things that you experience that maybe wouldn't be true in an urban or suburban context, especially with regards to the pandemic?
Yes. I mean, we just have such a limited staff. So the people to really help with the technology, to keep that up and running, to keep current on everything. We don't have the instructional coaches, the instructional support to really work with the teachers. The best way to do virtual learning. Our Education Service Center out of Amarillo has been doing a great job supporting the rural schools the best that they can, but it's still a lot to overcome this year. These past 8 months, everyone is tired. We're doing the best we can, and the fear of what else may be coming out of this next legislative session with additional requirements or additional mandates that we're already struggling to keep up with.
Right. So it's hard to believe this, but the next legislative session starts in a couple of months. Representative VanDeaver, can you talk about what you anticipate being the primary issues debated in the legislature that will impact rural schools?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the budget is going to be the elephant in the room. We know we are facing a huge deficit. Revenue has decreased, and we know we have a deficit going into session. And so, the budget is going to pretty much take up all the oxygen, I think. My hope is that we will fulfill the promises we made in House Bill 3 to the degree possible. We know that I'm telling my school superintendents, I don't think we'll see the cuts, the $5.4 billion cuts we saw a decade ago. But to think that education is going to come out this session totally unscathed, I think is just unrealistic. There will be some cuts. And so how we do that and do the least damage possible to our school districts and to our students and our teachers, I think that's going to be the priority. And we'll get there. It's not going to be easy. But I know my colleagues that I have visited with are committed to fulfilling the promises made in House Bill 3. So, but no doubt the budget is the big issue. Right.
Superintendent Hale, what, if anything, are you hoping the legislature will do? What are you asking them for this legislative session?
Yes. Like Representative VanDeaver said, I realize that there is going to be an issue with the revenue that's available, but just try their very best to sustain the state's portion of House Bill 3. It's very important for the small and rural schools to have that small and mid-sized school adjustment. Our economies of scale are quite different than the urban and rural schools, and we need that additional allotment because it costs more to educate in a smaller classrooms, but we still have the same fixed cost as your urban and rural schools. I would like to see there be a moratorium on the accountability for testing, just because we know that we are behind, and don't put a rating on us for this year. Give us an opportunity to try to make up those gains that we know that we are lacking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Georgina, do you want to add to that? What are you hoping the legislature will do for rural schools in particular?
To have a substantive conversation, right? It's very difficult to fix a problem when you don't even talk about a problem, right? It's very difficult to focus on the types of infrastructure and funding that we need when we rarely, if ever, hear a conversation about that occurring, particularly when we're looking at the shortfalls that our rural schools are facing. Number one, staffing, retention of great teachers. I mean, it's very difficult to get great teachers out in rural areas, and then they can drive 50 miles and make away and make so much more money, right? And then of course the additional salaries that teachers earn when they leave the classroom, right? Because they're moving up into administration, up into leadership. Why in the world are we paying people more to be further away from children, particularly in our rural districts? We need the balancing of wages, of salaries for our teachers to maintain great teachers in the classroom, especially in our rural districts.
Mm-hmm. You talked a little bit about the accountability ratings and the state standardized test, the STAR, moving forward this upcoming spring. And I know that a lot of superintendents and a lot of teachers and educators generally have been opposed to that, given how different this school year is. We're not actually back to normal. I'm sure you guys would agree with that from what you know from being in schools. What are the chances at this point, and this is for you, Representative VanDeaver, that gets pushed off or gets delayed another year? What power and what responsibility does the legislature have to try and make that happen, given what you've heard from educators?
Yeah, I hope that as a legislature, I hope we will do the right thing, which in my opinion is to press pause on accountability. We know that this is unprecedented. There are some that would argue that even without the pandemic, the accountability system is really not fair, and in many cases not fair to rural schools, and doesn't really measure what we intend to measure. And I tend to hold that opinion myself in some areas. But certainly, given the issues we're facing with the pandemic and the challenges we see in our school districts, I just don't see any way we can continue to put a grade on a school district or on a campus, given the challenges they're facing. Now, personally, and this may or may not be popular among the education community. Personally, I do believe we need to go ahead and administer STAR. If you followed my legislation since I've been in the House, I am not a fan of STAR. I will go on record in saying that. I do not believe STAR measures what we intend to measure, and I don't believe it's being used properly. But I do believe we need to have a measurement of where these students are. And personally, I want to see a comparison of the in-person student versus the virtual student or the distant learning student, because my teachers, my school people are telling me that if a student is in class and actually receiving instruction in person from a teacher, they're doing pretty well. but those that are learning virtually are really struggling. And I think we need to measure that. We need to know what that looks like. We need to quantify that so we can address it going forward. So personally, I'm in favor of administering the STAR or some measurement to measure where these students are. But I with a clear conscience, I can't say we need to continue with the accountability system. At some point, when we get past this pandemic, we're going to have to go back in time and find a benchmark where we can say, this was the last time we really truly had a measurement, and then take that and move forward from there. We just can't punish school districts for their performance during these very strange times.
Right. How do you feel about that, Superintendent Hale, in terms of moving forward with the STAR but without the accountability?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think most superintendents, we want accountability. We want a measurement, a benchmark. I don't think there's anyone that would ever disagree with that, honestly. But we don't want the rating associated with it, for especially this year. Even though I have few students that are doing remote learning, I have multiple students at any time quarantined because of close contact. And so those students are doing 2 weeks virtual. I have teachers that are quarantined because of close contact. When we don't have broadband internet, the quality of teaching, it's just not the same. Mm-hmm. So I really agree with Representative VanDeaver of going forward with administering the test, but just hold off on that being held to us as being having to meet those standards.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think we just have a few minutes left. I have one, kind of broad question left, but take it where you want to. What is the future of rural schools in Texas?
I personally think I'm a little frightened for it. If we're having to go into use fund balance, as many schools are already having to do, just to keep the doors open, and if we're seeing cuts this coming legislative session, that it's going to be even harder for schools to maintain that level if we're having to go into fund balance even more. House Bill 3 did a great job of supporting teachers and increasing those teacher salaries, but if we're looking at budget cuts, when the majority of that House Bill 3 money was for teacher salaries, what does that look like in our budget? Nobody wants to go back and take those salary increases back from teachers. I don't know that anybody wants to have that conversation, but I am worried about the future of rural education, just because it is a challenge to find quality teachers. It is a challenge for the internet. It is a challenge for economic development here. So I think I appreciate the Tribune having this panel, and for people to realize the challenges are very real and are different than what urban and large schools face.
Right. Yeah, Georgina, do you want to answer that?
What I see to foreshadow the future, when we're looking at, particularly in rural areas where children can't log on because of the lack of broadband, and parents that grow, or families that grow increasingly frustrated with doing the trying to be working because they're essential workers out here, and then taking a packet of paper and doing their very best to teach, right, as individuals who are not teachers, that's increasingly frustrating, and it frustrates the children as well. And so when those packets start to disappear, they're not being turned in, that means that's funding that's potentially lost, right? And so not only are we going into the next budget cycle with a deficit, schools are losing children from their enrollment, which also reduces revenue. So how is the state going to combat that and maintain the promises in House Bill 3 and help rural schools retain quality teachers? These are all serious challenges that, if the state of Texas doesn't make a real investment in public education, our rural schools are going to dramatically struggle to overcome. And I fear, honestly, that many may not, and we're going to start to see a consolidation of our smaller ISDs, which means we have ISDs that are going to consolidate as they are hundreds of miles apart. It's not the way to do things, and it hasn't been for quite some time. And the pandemic really is shining quite a bit of sunlight on where we need to make some serious adjustments.
Right. Yeah, Representative VanDeaver, we'll end with your response to that question.
Okay, yes, and I agree with the comments that have been made. I think I am very concerned about the future of rural education. But I will say this, I believe there is a silver lining to this because, as was mentioned, the pandemic has really placed a light on a lot of the issues that we've been facing in rural Texas for years. And I really believe that those who at one time would say that maybe a teacher is not that important. I don't believe you can. I don't believe you can say that with a straight face anymore after the pandemic. Those who would say that we can do it much less expensively virtually and get the same results. I believe the pandemic has shown us that is not the case. So I believe we're getting some great data, and I wish we were not going through it, but I believe we can make lemonade out of these lemons that we've been served, and not take our foot off the gas on rural broadband, on teacher salaries, on teacher recruitment, on teacher prep, those kinds of things. Rural Texas, we have to have our schools. We know that. We know the importance of that, and so it's just important as we go forward that we remember this pandemic and remember the things we've learned from this pandemic, and look for solutions to those issues.
Okay. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Gary VanDeaver, Gina Pérez, and Donna Hale for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org and help us keep the conversation going by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kate McGee, and I'm the higher education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in for this conversation on higher education as part of the Texas Tribune Symposium on the Future of Rural Texas. I'm joined today by Brenda Kays, Mike Reeser, and Sandra Woodley. Brenda Kays serves as president of Kilgore College. Previously, she served as president of the Stanley Community College, vice president of student learning and success at Guilford Technical Community College, and chief academic officer and dean of instructional services at Vernon College in Texas. Mike Reeser has served as chancellor and CEO of Texas State Technical College since 2010. Previously, he served as president of Texas State Technical College, West Texas. He's also served in various roles at the college, including vice president and dean of instruction. And Sandra Woodley has served as the president of the University of Texas Permian Basin since 2017. Previously, she served as the CEO of the University of Louisiana System. She has also served in executive positions for higher educational systems in Alabama, Kentucky, and Arizona. Thanks to you all for being with us, and let's get started. From here, I wanted to start big picture. Brenda, we'll start with you. What would you say is the state of higher education in Texas's more rural areas, taking into account the pandemic, but also more broadly than that?
Well, of course, we had challenges to overcome once COVID-19 hit, and we had to go into the remote learning environment. And I think some of the challenges that we faced was access. Students did not have the access that they needed with regards to the internet, high-speed internet. Some students didn't even have access to the hardware that they needed on a regular basis. In fact, the Texas Association of Community Colleges did a survey with Trellis in order to help all of the community colleges across the state actually pinpoint how our students were struggling. And so not only were we hearing this anecdotally, but we heard this directly from the students at KC that actually responded to the survey. And I think one of the interesting things that we found, especially because of the population that we serve a lot of students who are single parents or they are families and they're working. And with their children actually being at home, learning remotely, at that point in time, they were lacking a quiet place to study. And that's one of the things that came out of the survey that we received, so that we did have the opportunity to take some action steps to try to help all of our students have the access that they needed in order to complete the courses that they enrolled for the spring, and then also moving forward in the summer and fall.
And Sandra, how about across the state in Odessa? What are you seeing with challenges that students might be facing with the pandemic in more remote areas too in West Texas?
Well, similar to, Brenda's situation there at her college, we also had students in our university who had to flip very quickly from face-to-face learning in March to online learning. And some of those students really just don't learn as easily without being in a classroom. And we also had technological challenges. Sometimes, we had to use the Federal CARES Act money. We used that to ship hotspots and also laptops to students to make sure that they could continue their learning during the pandemic. I think we did really well, but many of our students did struggle, I think, with the mode of instruction when they weren't used to the online learning. We also were very proud of our faculty. We have a few flip phone faculty who literally only had a flip phone that had to switch pretty quickly into transforming their class into online learning. And like people do in a crisis, they rose to the occasion, and we did our best, and I think we came out okay. We still continue to worry about internet access in these rural areas, because even if you have a hotspot, sometimes there's just not enough coverage for them to be able to have the high-speed internet that they need. For example, if they're in an engineering program and very complicated software that they have to use that takes a lot of bandwidth. So I think technology is one of the biggest challenges that we've had, and we've worked really hard to overcome it, but I think more definitely needs to be done in the future.
Mike, I'm wondering, how has the pandemic affected students who are in technical programs, especially ones that might be more hands-on and in-person learning is really key? How have you, handled that, and how are students, dealing with that?
Kate, the hands-on nature caused special challenges for TSTC and the community colleges who do technical and vocational training. We haven't found a way, for example, to teach welding through a web browser. You have to get your hands on the gear. So at TSTC, we operated in ways that I'm sure the community colleges did too, and that is we found ways to safely return to the lab. For us, that was the first week of May. We returned to face-to-face work. And we did it, though, using CDC recommendations for social distancing, constant hand hygiene, and face coverings. And to date, we've had an extremely laudable track record in terms of avoiding outbreaks in those situations. But it puts a real strain on facilities and faculty.
And can you elaborate on that? How does it put strain on facilities?
Well, in some situations, there are technologies in which students work side by side on various equipment, maybe robotics or diesel, or you may be in the cockpit of an airplane with an instructor. Social distancing can't occur in those situations without spreading out people. And when that happens, your lab space is essentially cut in half. And so the ability to throughput students in a particular given space and time is challenged. So too are the amount of hours faculty have to spend with those students, because we often had to shift laboratory time. So faculty were frankly spending more hours.
Brenda, I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about the challenges of the pandemic. Has the pandemic created opportunities for rural colleges as you shift online to maybe reach more students and be more flexible for students who are not so close to, college, the college campus, and maybe can access school more with online?
Well, yes, truthfully, we did see an opportunity come our way because of us having to go into the remote learning. We actually launched something a little bit early. We were planning on doing a beta of what we call a brick or click environment for the summer that would allow students the flexibility to access their classes based on what their time schedule looked like, how they actually learn best. And so it was a combination of actually a face-to-face environment as an option, a synchronous environment, and we used Collaborate a lot for that environment, but also an asynchronous environment. And so we were actually recording the lectures, and students could access them at a time that fit them best. And so now we're seeing that develop more and more at the college, where students do have the flexibility to actually take courses as it best meets their needs, their schedules, and how they learn best, their learning modalities. And so that was definitely, I guess you could say, an advantage. But once again, I echo what Sandra said. Our faculty, and it continues to amaze me how quickly they were able to do this. We actually announced on March 13th that we were not going to be having face-to-face classes for the spring 2 semester, or the continuation of the 16-week semester. And they spent about a week getting ready. Now, for those faculty that were already teaching online or teaching in a hybrid classroom, it wasn't nearly as difficult. But for those faculty members that actually had never taught an online class, it was really a struggle, but they rose to the occasion. They were doing practice sessions with Collaborate to make sure that they could connect with their students. And so it was remarkable to see it happen, but it did pave the way for us to move forward with our brick or click environment.
Sandra, I'm wondering, we've heard a lot around the country in Texas about enrollment declines in colleges, but UT Permian Basin saw an increase this year. And I'm wondering if you were surprised by that and what you can attribute that increase to.
Well, we were not surprised by it. We certainly did white knuckle it for a while because we have, really invested in enrollment management here, a whole comprehensive plan, and working really hard to reach into our neighboring communities here, to increase our enrollment. Our goal at the University of Texas Permian Basin is to double the number of people who get a degree from our institution over the next 10 years. And in order to do that, part of it comes from enrollment. I do believe that we benefited from the safety of staying in your own neighborhood. 80% of our students come from the surrounding areas. Almost all of our students are from Texas, honestly. And so I think we were a University of Texas institution with very high quality programs and a safe place to stay at home with all of the uncertainty of the COVID. But we were up overall about 5%. Our first time freshman was up over 40%. So we're really pleased that our students responded, to their hometown institution. I would like to also echo something that Brenda said. We do believe that out of this crisis and all of the changes that we've had to make to accommodate COVID-19, that there's going to be a lot of that we keep even when we go back to quote unquote normal. The high flex courses, the ability to record some of those really important lectures like in math and engineering that are more difficult to grasp, for students to be able to go back at any time and to be able to review that material, I think will be very helpful. Flipping the classroom, using online modules and segments to be able to teach the course, and for the students to be able to learn ahead of time before they get into the lecture, and then being able to use that face-to-face lecture time in a much higher performing way for the students. So we do think that, out of any crisis, and this one is no different, we really have some silver linings and some opportunities that will help us be better in the future.
As the state deals with this pandemic, rural areas are also seeing this huge population shift. Texas is growing in its urban areas and declining in a lot of rural areas. And I'm wondering how that's affecting your universities when it comes to enrollment and recruitment of new students to convince them to stay in your area. Mike, I'm wondering how your school is adjusting to this population shift and what it means for you.
I think the first thing to acknowledge is that those trends are true, but the rural region is not necessarily a homogeneous sort of array. There are some counties in Texas that are very sparsely populated, and they have a particular character. And then there are those that actually contain some larger cities, and they have a different profile altogether too. And so the students, we found students are students wherever you find them, but the circumstances in which they've grown up can shape their expectations and also their preparation for higher education. And so we have to stay mindful of that wherever we happen to be seeking students. And so the amount of diversity in rural Texas is really a key factor. And it's all about capabilities of the social infrastructures in which the kids get to grow up, or the adults who also have come back to school.
Brenda, what about you? What are you seeing when it comes to shifting population, and how is that affecting you and your role at Kilgore?
With the ISDs, independent school districts that we serve, we have not seen the steep decline yet that has been predicted. And so I think that what I'd like to do is I'd like to focus more on the idea that if we can actually provide the educational resources that are necessary to those students who live in a rural area, and we can educate them at home, they're much more likely to stay in the community. And that's, of course, if there's also a position or a job available for them that will produce a living wage. But we hear so often about the brain drain, that individuals are seeking opportunities outside rural Texas. Well, we start to lose some of our students for those individuals if the program is not available that they want to pursue, or we cannot actually deliver it through some of the technology we've already referenced today, that they're going to enroll someplace else, and the chances that they'll come back home then become slim to none. So I think that's extremely important. The people that we have, they are one of our greatest resources in rural Texas.
I'm wondering, Mike, when you have more and more jobs requiring some kind of post-secondary credential, how you convince students from rural areas to stay in the area rather than going to a city that might have a similar program. What kind of message do you send to students to try and make sure that they enroll in your school and are staying in the areas they grow up to get a job after they graduate?
Well, to build on what Brenda just said, I can tell you what we do at TSTC is we begin with the end in mind. That is, when we interact with a prospective student, the first thing we ask them is, what are your dreams? What do you aspire to do? And one of the questions we often ask is, do you want to stay close to home, or would you rather live somewhere else? Because your professional aspirations will be impacted by that. Based on that question, we typically have pathways that are available that will allow a student to stay at home and work in industries that are embedded in rural Texas, or if they so desire, head somewhere else in the state to pursue that. So we have pathways with both in mind, but the key part is always start with the end in mind when you're interacting with those students.
Sandra, I want to shift a little bit. We're heading into another legislative session soon, and you mentioned, the issue of broadband and technology. And I'm wondering what lawmakers can do to best support the state's rural schools and students when it comes to technology, but maybe also in other areas this session.
Well, the Midland and Odessa area, there are several community groups who are working on that very issue, and they're working with legislators in Austin as well. It's going to be really important that we shore up the equivalent access, if you will, to those students who aren't right here, students who are in those rural areas who don't have it, because whether or not you have more face-to-face in the future and some online, you're going to need that technology to be successful. So that is a really important thing that the legislature can do. I think it's also true that the legislature can help universities make sure that our classrooms are equipped with the technology needed to really have these high quality online experiences for students. We've really struggled and scrambled to try to get up to a standard in all of our classrooms so that our faculty will be able to create those really high quality experiences. And I think that's another thing that Austin can do. The legislature can, prioritize, I think, technology funds for universities and for students.
Brenda, I'm curious what you're hoping to see this legislative session when it comes to higher education.
I believe that the community colleges have enjoyed great support from the Texas legislature, and we're so thankful for that. However, I believe that the pandemic has actually accelerated the idea that not all students have equal access to post-secondary education. And it's not just to post-secondary education, it's access to resources. And so I hope that the Texas legislature will continue upon the same path that they've set for themselves and think about the idea that there are students who, without that access, and whether it's the internet access that we've talked about, whether it's reliable transportation, access to quality health care, making sure that there are jobs available to students who will pay that family supporting wage. I think that in rural Texas, we tend to see an overrepresentation of economic and academic challenged students. And so it's providing the resources that they need in order to access post-secondary education, whether that is additional supplemental dollars for those students who are able to receive federal financial aid, whether that's making sure that all of the other things that students need are put in place so that they can concentrate on going to school. But for yourself, if you go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's hard for a student to actually concentrate on studying if perchance they find themselves in a circumstance where there's not enough food at home, or possibly a family member needs medical care. They don't have the insurance dollars to be able to do that. And so they're going to have to go back into the workforce. Usually at a wage that is less than family supporting because they don't have that college education. So I think it's just recognizing the characteristics of the population as well as the lack of access.
We have a couple of questions from audience members, and I wanted to ask one to you, Mike. How can higher education in rural regions of Texas partner with industries to develop career opportunities for students in burgeoning new fields? Do you have advice or ideas to improve those kind of connections?
Well, it's like any sort of collaborative effort at industrial scales. It begins by building relationships. I think the dialogue has to exist between college and the industrial and employer base that is in the region that it serves. And if that dialogue is robust and meaningful, then inevitably the talk about creating a supply chain of talented workforce will occur. That allows the college to be situated in a way that it is a bridge between those who aspire a great local job and those employers who are seeking skilled talent. And that's a core purpose of education overall. And so those relationships are where it all begins.
Sandra, another audience member named Glenn, is not just curious about obstacles facing post-secondary education in rural areas, but strategies that schools have implemented to help those students that have really shown promise. And I'm wondering if there's anything specific at UT Permian Basin that's really been shown to work and help students with access and other issues.
Well, I mean, similar to what Mike was referring to, we have put a lot of emphasis on paid internships and co-ops and opportunities for our students to have paying jobs while they're learning on the job training with the industry leaders here. You know, in the Midland, Odessa area, there's a lot of opportunities with many companies in the energy industry in particular, and we work really hard to connect those students very early in their career with those opportunities. I think it is important, as Mike said, to start with the end in mind and really, focus on what the student needs to be successful and what they're interested in. We also find it a great strategy here to partner with our community colleges in Midland and Odessa, particularly because many students, myself included, I started in a community college, wouldn't have made it in school at all without the community college. Many students have a better experience starting at the community college. And then we have these really important pathways for them to very seamlessly go on and get a baccalaureate degree if that's what they would like to do in their future. Stackable credentials, I think, is something that is important for us to do. Workforce training, that when they do that stacks into an applied degree later. Those are some of the strategies that we're focusing on here in the Permian Basin.
And, really quickly, I had a question for all three of you that I'd love you to answer. What do you think is the biggest misconception that lawmakers and the general public have about rural college students in the state? Brenda, if you want to start.
I would think that it could possibly be that all college students are the same. If you're 18 to 22 years old, you fit into a certain category. And I think that as we've discussed this morning, and as you've heard from Sandra, and as you've heard from Mike, that's just not the case. I'm not saying that students across the state don't sometimes face different types of challenges. However, once again, I'll go back to the idea, it's the lack of access to resources that I think that we see most in the rural areas of the state.
Sandra, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think typically sometimes legislators will feel that if a person doesn't graduate in 4 years, then somehow they're a failure. It took me 10 years and 2 babies and working full time to get my degree, and I don't consider myself a failure. And many of our students are first generation students who have to work full-time jobs to find their way through school. So our mission is to get them to the finish line, and it's a minor point how long it takes them to get to the finish line. So I think it is important to understand that there's a large group of students, not all of them, some of them should and can graduate in 4 and 6 years, and we certainly do focus on that for our students who can, but for the students who need extra time, not to consider them a failure as they make their way through all of the obstacles that they have to overcome to be successful.
And Mike, you can have the last word on your thoughts.
Well, thank you. I have to confess, I haven't met a legislator who had a misconception about our students per se, but I am concerned that the circumstances during this upcoming challenging session are ones that may tempt some to look at higher ed as a place to balance the budget. And I would say this, our economic realities are an economy that's challenged by unemployment and sectors who are struggling. It's a skilled workforce that's going to be the answer to all of those issues. And that skilled workforce is built by higher education.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you to Brenda Kays, Mike Reeser, and Sandra Woodley for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org and help us keep the conversation going by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Thank you so much, everyone.